Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask for a bit of hush now, we're going to hand over to Justin Harrington. You've probably seen the display at the far side of the field just now. You get the Harrington coach and 5 Harrington Alpines together. Fantastic display, something we're not going to see very often. And Justin's going to tell us all about the relationship with Harrington and Roots, and a bit of history about the cars and the coach companies. Could I ask you to put your hands together for Justin Harrington?
Tim, thank you very much indeed, and particularly thank you for having invited me to come and talk this afternoon. I was never sure which was the worst slot to do, either straight after lunch, known as the graveyard slot, or this one, the pre-bar opening slot. So I will try not to detain you anything beyond at least my allotted time. Now, there's already quite a lot of material out there relating to Harringtons. Variously, all the work that was done by Yannick Baum, sadly now departed, who put together a very, very comprehensive history of Harrington Alpines. More recently, there's been the article in the Alpine Hall. And I particular kudos there to Glenn Brackenridge and Andrew Yates for pulling together a bunch of material that I'd certainly never seen before. So what I'm hoping to do this afternoon is to fill in a few gaps. I hope that what I'm going to be talking about doesn't cover too much of the ground that's been covered in recent press articles. I should also have mentioned the one in the current classic and sports car article, which I must admit took me by surprise, having been written by a journalist who pitched up at the Harrington Reunion Day at Witham, not so long ago. But it was a good article, and as I say, there's quite a lot already out there. So, a brief canter through, if I can get that thing to work. Right, okay. Thomas Harrington was formed as a company in 1897 in Brighton. But as to who Thomas Harrington was my great-grandfather. He was born in London in 1858. His father, Reuben, had been a pipe maker. Very soon after Thomas was born, in about 1860, 1861, the family moved down to Brighton. Thomas was one of 3 brothers and a sister. His father still showed the occupation as pipe maker, but in 1874, Thomas was apprenticed as a wheelwright. Now, because of the number of people who tended to visit Brighton, then a very fashionable resort, for the weekend, he built up a very good trade as a wheelwright. And in 1897, press the right key eventually, he set up in business with about 10 colleagues and formed Thomas Harrington Limited. This was in Church Street in Brighton. There was a good availability of craft skills in that area at the time. There was also, as well as the wheelwrighting skills, there was also quite a thriving furniture manufacturing business there. So the skills that were necessary for starting up initially a small coach building business were readily available. So having set the business up in Church Street, Brighton, 10 or 11 of them, their initial focus was on building horse-drawn carriages, flys, landaus, and so forth. I do recall at one point being told that their first big contract was building a fleet of milk floats for a local dairy company. I've never actually managed to find verification of that. But as passenger transport developed, they moved on to building charabancs, sidecars, and particularly during the First World War, converting vehicles from goods carrying to carrying people, particularly for transporting troops, both in this country and on the Western Front. So the business was growing quite steadily over its first 15 years. Now, the earliest picture, and I hope people at the back can see this, I've never managed to find a verifiable photograph of any of the early horse-drawn vehicles. And in fact, the earliest car that I can find a picture of is this 1914 Austro-Daimler, apparently commissioned by a Russian nobleman who wasn't able to take delivery of it until after the First World War. That's the earliest one I've been able to find. This car now forms part of the Porsche collection in Germany. And in fact, there were a number of Austro-Daimlers that the company built over the years. And I think they actually had a distributorship for that make. During the 1920s, the coach building industry in this country really thrived. Typically, what people would do, certainly for upmarket cars, would buy a chassis from a chassis manufacturer and then take it to one of many coach building companies. And I'll come back in a moment to give an illustration of the scale of it. It wasn't only upmarket stuff, as this 1923 Peugeot, a very simple looking car, actually illustrates. Now, one of the early innovations within the company was they were a very early licensee of the Wayman method of building coachwork. This had been pioneered in France. I can't go into the technical details of it, mainly because I don't really understand them, but it's a way of making the body reasonably flexible without actually weakening the framework for it. There were about a dozen companies licensed in this country to do to build bodywork on the Wayman principle. And Thomas Harrington's one of them. But to give you, as I mentioned just now, an idea of the scale of the coach building business in this country, there's a website which it's very easy to spend ridiculous amounts of time on, called coachbuild.com. That lists over 250 coach building companies that were active in the UK in the 1920s and 1930s. So it was a thriving industry. Very, very few of those companies still exist. The other thing I'd mention, and this is an advert, and it mentions in it that Thomas Harringtons are concessionaires for both Talbot and Darracq cars. The family seems to have been extremely keen on various French makes of car, Darracq being one of them, and one that I know my own grandfather was particularly keen on was Ballot. So there were a lot of cars that were built on these French manufactured chassis. More on that in a moment. This is one I'd love to know more about. It's a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost that was built in about 1925-26 for an Indian Maharaja. I haven't been able to find out precisely who it was built for. One of the leading authorities on cars owned by the Maharajas in India is a chap called Gotan Singh, who's written quite a number of books on the subject. He's drawn a blank on it as well. But this photograph is quite well known. It's been published on quite a few occasions. But I'd love to know for whom it was built. There might be a clue in the mascot. The mascot on the radiator grille isn't the normal Rolls-Royce Spirit of Ecstasy, but unfortunately, because of where the photograph was taken, I haven't been able to discern what that mascot actually shows. If anybody's got any knowledge or anybody who might have any ideas, please let me know. One thing I should have said, perhaps at the outset, is that whilst I'm trying to fill in some gaps here, there are some huge gaps in my own knowledge as well. So please, if somebody thinks I've got something wrong or can fill in one of those gaps, do please tell me. Another Rolls-Royce, this is a Phantom 1 that was built by the company. It's got one of the trademark features that the company tended to have, which is a side step rather than full running boards. And over the years, a number of different sort of design features tended to appear. That was one of them. Another one was a sort of V-shaped windscreen, which tended to be a trademark of the cars that Harrington built. Now, I mentioned an affiliation with French cars. Four Bugattis, 3 of them Type 44s, I believe, on which Harrington's built bodies. I think all of these still exist, and I gather that Harrington's were one of only 2 coach builders in the UK who were officially sanctioned by Ettore Bugatti as coach builders in this country, the other one being James Young. Now, that didn't mean that other people couldn't or wouldn't build bodies on Bugatti chassis, but Ettore Bugatti, who did apparently visit the Harrington factory on a few occasions, was one. He approved Harrington's as a builder. Just jumping forward a little bit, Austro-Daimler I mentioned earlier. In 1928, a team of Austro-Daimlers competed in the Tourist Trophy races at Ards, and they won the team prize. Now, these cars, 2 of them still exist to our knowledge. One, I believe, is in New Zealand. One is now in Germany. The one that is now in Germany was over in Ireland and was found and auctioned in, I think, 2004. Yes, 2004. And the pre-sale estimate was that it would go for between £70,000 and £90,000. Now, from having seen pictures of it in the auction catalogue, that would have struck anyone as being a slightly ambitious figure for something which, frankly, needed total restoration. It actually went for £362,750, and again, apparently, forms part of the Porsche family collection. So it just shows how wrong you can be. Another one, a 1928 Graham-Paige. Now, this was its 3rd body that had been built by Harrington's, and this particular car's claim to fame was that it won the last ever race at Brooklands in August 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War and before the Brooklands circuit was effectively lost to motorsport forever. Again, what's happened to it subsequently? No idea. So just backtracking a little bit now, and I hope the screen is reasonably legible. By the 1920s, it had developed into a successful business. Thomas Senior's 2 sons, Thomas and Ernest, were both now working in the business, and their 2 sons, who'd been born in 1911 and 1912 respectively, they started working in the business as well. But one of the problems that they had was that in the original premises in Church Street, they had no room for expansion. They were able to secure a site in the Old Shoreham Road in Hove, for anybody who's familiar with the area, which enabled significant expansion. One of the features was that the requirement for coach-built cars was beginning to decrease, but at the same time, the requirement for passenger coaches, by definition taking up an awful lot more space and requiring longer in each case to build, that was increasing. They needed more space. They'd also taken on a car distributorship. They had franchises for Talbot, for Darrett, for Ballow, as I mentioned earlier. I'm also told, or was also told, but again haven't managed to verify, that they had Buick and Austro-Daimler franchises as well. They started to develop a relationship with the Roots family in the 1930s. Now, for those who are familiar with Roots history, you may be aware that the Roots brothers had started out as cycle dealers, initially in Hawkhurst, just not that far from here. But then their first large garage that they established was in Maidstone, just down the road, where they had the sole distributorship rights for South East England for Austin motor cars. Somebody unfortunately trod on their toes and started distributing Austin cars in competition with them, and the case went to court, as a result of which the Roots brothers won their case, were awarded damages, and that enabled the acquisition of a number of car manufacturing companies, including initially Hillman and Humber. And as they became manufacturers, so they required distributors. And Harringtons were taken on as distributors in Sussex for Roots cars. But it's interesting that given where we are now, that the Roots business effectively, at scale, started just down the road from here. So, Sackville Works, which was the company's premises in the old Shoreham Road. Built during 1929-1930. Interestingly enough, the construction work on it started just after Thomas Senior died. Now, I know that Thomas Senior was a very cautious businessman, and it may be that the two sons didn't want to rock the boat too much by committing to building a scale factory such as this while he was still alive. That's the finished factory with some East Kent Road Car Company buses, one of their original and early passenger coach customers lined up outside. But whilst you can see that it is quite an extensive site, you'll also see that this was one of the reasons why the company's ultimate growth was hampered. On two sides, there's a railway line. On the third side, there's road frontage. And on the fourth side, there's a graveyard. That somehow restricts the capacity for expanding that site. Okay, you've heard me droning on enough for a short while. Any guesses as to what these are? I would suggest that they're both Harrington built bodies. Top left should be reasonably straightforward. I'll wager that nobody would know what bottom right is. Any guesses? No. Well, is that top left or bottom right, Chris? But no, both wrong. No, nearly. No, not quite. It's a Renault. Top left is a Renault. Bottom right. Anybody ever heard of a make called Beverly Barnes? Another short-lived company. They're just like, I say there were something over 250 coach building companies in the UK. You think of the number of small car manufacturing companies there were, that have just been absorbed or disappeared altogether. I rather like the coachwork, particularly on that one on the bottom right. Can't say I'm too keen on the Renault one, but anyway, be that as it may. It wasn't all about cars, and it wasn't all about sort of reasonably upmarket coach-built cars. There was a bulk order from Cars Biscuits for a guide, for delivery vans on guide vessels. I love that one on the left. It was built for a local egg producer in Sussex. The cab is designed to represent a chicken coop, and the load platform on the back is egg-shaped. It doesn't still exist, I don't think. Now, one of the main reasons for moving to the larger premises, as I mentioned earlier, was the business increasingly moving towards commercial vehicles. So amongst the contracts that they had were for a lot of coach operators, particularly in the south of England, but also the GPO, top left picture there, were a long-term customer as well. So commercial vehicles, coaches, all of them requiring quite a lot of build space and taking quite a time to build, we're all core business. Right, now, probably Harrington's best known design feature for their coaches, the dorsal fin. This is one of the vehicles that was at the rally at Withell a few weeks ago now, and is quite a known vehicle on the classic coach circuit. This is actually a post-war model. We'll come to a pre-war one in a moment. But the dorsal fin was developed for three reasons, I guess. One, as a design feature, what the marketing people would probably now call a USP or something like that. But it also, first of all, it enabled, it provided very efficient means of extracting stale air at the tail end of the coach. It also provided additional headroom at the back of the coach to enable a more curved roofline at the rear. Introduced in 1935-36, something of that order, and it was actually available as an option on Harrington coaches right through to about 1960. This is, I think, the earliest known example. It's in beautiful condition, this. It's called the observation coach. And what doesn't really show in this photograph is that as well as having the side windows and windows set into the roof actually slides back as well. So to all intents and purposes, it makes an open coach. It's a lovely vehicle. Again, this one was at Withell and is the one coach that is featured in the article that's in the current edition of Classic and Sports Car. It's a fabulous piece of kit. Arguably the earliest motorhome in the UK. This was commissioned by a Mr. McMullen. Now, it looks a little bit like a double-decker coach bus. It was originally called the Land Cruiser. When Mr. McMullen took delivery of it, it was christened as Protos. Downstairs accommodation was a living room, a washroom, upstairs single and double bedroom. The washroom downstairs was all fitted out in marble. It had a promenade deck at the front. It was fitted with Art Deco style windows, silk curtains, gun racks, fishing rods. And I somehow suspect that now the Lalique radiator mascot that it had would probably be worth more than that thing cost to build in the first place. Unfortunately, it doesn't still exist. During the Second World War, it was converted back to being used for passenger transport. But I think it was probably well used by Captain and Mrs. McMullen in the time after they built it. So during the Second World War, like any other business of this nature, the factory was turned entirely over to war work. Not only doing ground vehicles, but also components for Spitfires, quite a lot of prototyping work for the Air Ministry, and I believe just the airframes for Lysander and Mosquito aircraft. I have heard it said that they built complete Lysanders. I'm not absolutely sure about that, because even though the Lysander was notable as being a short takeoff and landing aircraft, I don't think you'd be able to take off one of those from the old Shoreham Road or that factory site. I suspect it was just the airframes for later assembly by Westlands. So after the war, the business returned to car making, and in about 1949, another branch in Worthing was added. Where the Worthing premises are now, and they're still there actually, until a few years ago they were the Audi distributors in Worthing. They are now the Volkswagen van and Skoda distributors running from that site. I'm afraid the building no longer looks like that. It's had a modern square frontage put on it, but it was a building that had been put up in the 1930s, originally by a company called Presta Motor Company, which was set up by a couple of fairly well-known racing drivers. Jim Elwes was one of them. He was a works driver for Aston Martin. And the other one, whose name has gone out of my mind, but it will come back to me, is Charles somebody or other, who also drove for Aston Martin and for MG. And when they set it up, it was absolutely a state of the art for maintaining sporting cars. There was quite a long article about it written during the late 1930s in Motorsport magazine. Harrington's took on those premises immediately after the Second World War. Just as a slight diversion, my father was the general manager there from 1960 to 1965. The core business during the 1950s remained as coach building, operating alongside the Roots distributorship. But it wasn't only building coaches. Also, a couple of fire tenders. Some of the Green Goddesses, which got themselves into the news not that many years ago as being called into service when there was a fireman strike. Not really a fire engine, it's more a mobile fire pump. Harrington's built a number of those to a War Department specification. The vehicle on the top right there, that was built for the London Salvage Corps, and as far as I know, apart from the Green Goddess, that was the only fire plants they built. But they did build a lot of horse boxes. Southern Railways were a major customer for horse boxes, believe it or not. And that again was one of their products for which they were well known. They also built customised coaches. The one on the left there, known as the Night Rider, that was built for the directors of Maidstone and District, the local bus company to here, effectively as a travelling boardroom. The one on the right, the Indian, that was built on an AEC chassis, and the story behind it is that somebody had set up a business running overland coach tours from the UK to India using a pretty ancient AEC bus with Harrington bodywork on it. The business was successful, so he decided that rather than relying on an old vehicle, he would commission one specially for this journey. He used an AEC chassis because he'd been impressed by that, and he asked Harrington's to build the bodywork for it. I should probably put a trigger warning on what I'm about to read, because this comes from a press article that was written when the vehicle had been completed and had just been put into service. I don't think this article would be written using these words now. The crew consists of a driver, a co-driver, and a hostess who is so duskily attractive that several tough, travel-stained Fleet Street men took one look at the sari-clad charmer and rushed off to try to sell their foreign editors the idea of accompanying the coach to Calcutta. How long it ran for, I don't know, but it was another slightly unusual one. Probably the best known Harrington coach, the Italian job. It was a Bedford VAL chassis with the twin front axles, and well, I guess we've all seen the film several times, and particularly in the opening shot with the Harrington name across the front of it. After the film was completed, the coach actually returned to public service work for a coach company up in Scotland and was subsequently scrapped. A replica of it has been built recently, and in fact I saw it only a few weeks ago, parked in a lay-by up near where I live in near Abingdon. But it hasn't got any Harrington badges on it, so it can't be real. It's not only, however, fictitious crimes. There are some featured in some real crimes as well. The Black Maria that was used for transporting the great train robbers to and from court and ultimately to serve their time at Her Majesty's pleasure was a vehicle, again, built by Harringtons. So that takes us to the 1960s. Coach building, core business. Bodywork for cars, however, was still very much on the agenda, but nothing like to the extent that it had been in the 20s and 30s. There were some one-offs that were built. I haven't got decent photographs of them, but for example, one of the family members commissioned a very pleasant-looking Sunbeam Talbot 90 with a coupe body, fixed head coupe bodywork on it. There's also a stretched limousine on a Humber Super Snipe chassis. But the Alpine I'll get there eventually. The Alpine provided the the basis for reinvigorating the car side of the business. In effect, the coach building business was starting to decline, and the company was looking for ways to use skills that they developed, particularly in the use of fiberglass, which was becoming increasingly used during the 1950s, in a way that required less space. We talked about the space constraints earlier, and was less working capital intensive. Obviously, the amount of time taken to produce a car, rather less than the amount of time taken to produce a coach. The relationship with Roots gave rise to the Sunbeam Harrington Alpine, which conceptually the ground touring version of the Alpine. I have to say, I think there's quite a lot of artistic license in the way in which Ron Humphreys, who was the designer and draftsman, produced the cover picture for the brochure. It does look rather longer and sleeker, perhaps, than in real life, but lovely picture nevertheless. Now, one particular feature, which I think has caused quite a lot of confusion, I've become more aware of it recently, was that a large proportion of the original Harrington Alpines, the roof was retrofitted to existing pre-registered Alpines. I had quite a long conversation with a gentleman recently who initially thought that because his car was a Series 1 Alpine, it was probably the Harrington prototype. We looked into it in quite some detail, and it was actually a hardtop that was retrofitted onto a pre-registered Series 1 Alpine. The original Harrington Alpines were built on Series 2s. Now, there were a couple of reasons for this. One, flexibility, enabling people to have their car converted. But the main reason for it, and which became a bit of a feature later on, was that by having the hardtop retrofitted, it avoided purchase tax liability that would have applied had the car been bought new, complete. So call it a tax dodge if you like, but that's one of the reasons why so many of the original Harrington Alpines were retrofitted. And I'd venture to suggest that there are probably no two that are absolutely identical. I was aware of, until today, two with cantilever boot lids. Today I've become aware of a third one with a cantilever boot lid. Most of them just have a normal external hinged boot lid. So, one of the most famous outings, as it were, and the car that actually generated more publicity than anything else, was the 1961 Le Mans car, 3000 RW. You'll see from this picture of it at scrutineering of the Mans 1961 that there are a couple of features. First of all, the rear windows are a slightly different shape from on the standard production car. They're curved at the rear edge rather than squared off, and also the roof vent, which isn't there on the standard production car. So this car, which went on to win the Index of Thermal Efficiency at Le Mans, it ran alongside a standard shaped bodied, I should say, car, 3001 RW. Both still exist. Both of those cars still exist. 3000 is currently in the USA. 3001 is in this country, having been rebuilt after quite significant accident damage later on in its life. This picture, which I think was the cover picture on the Horn, actually, I noticed a few editions ago, that shows the faired-in headlights. When my cousin rescued the car in the late 1970s, it had standard front wings fitted onto it because it had been involved in a road accident. But in the course of restoring it, he had the front wings reshaped by a fairly well-known coach builder by the name of Rob Jolly, who operates out of Lymington. Rob did a superb job on the front wings and also on the valance under the radiator grille, which was non-standard. Shows the three, I suppose, plus the Le Mans car, essential different shapes of Harrington Alpine. Top left, you've got the original one, then we move on to the Harrington Le Mans, and then bottom right, that's a Series C. The Harrington Le Mans was obviously the most radical change to them, with the rear wings being cut down, and obviously that was something which theoretically, at any rate, could not be retrofitted. I mean, I guess if you took your car along, but it was sold as a production car. So the purchase tax avoidance principle that I mentioned earlier, not so easily applied with the Harrington Le Mans. Now, if you think there was artistic license with the original Harrington Alpine brochure, He really went to town with that one. Much longer, lower, sleeker, wider. Again, lovely picture. But the artistic license, I think, extends further than just the picture. Quote from the text, which I expect some of you will have read previously. This super deluxe model will appeal to the motorist who not only requires above average sports car performance, but insists on the ultimate in luxury and comfort. When you're selling the car for pretty nearly the same price as an E-Type Jaguar, then I guess you've got to big it up somehow. The Harrington Alpine, the Harrington Le Mans, I beg your pardon, was an expensive car. Depending on specification, talking about £1,450 typically, compared to, in round figures, £950 for a standard Series 2 Alpine. That's a substantial price premium and really was taking you into sort of E-Type Jaguar territory. So just some other illustrations of them. That's a high-spec export version of the car. Possibly, I'm not absolutely sure, but possibly the car that was exhibited at the New York Motor Show, photographs taken at Devil's Dyke, just outside Brighton. Although I was reading something, it might well have been on the website just recently, suggesting that that was one of the 3 cars that were initially exported to routes in America for road test purposes. In contrast to the high spec, white-wall tyres, wire wheels, etc., there's a fairly low spec UK market one. That was my car, pictured in about 1985. Now, this car has actually been advertised up for sale in France for about the last couple of years. Initially, it was on the market for £50,000, not euros, pounds. I checked on Car and Classic website earlier this week. It's still being advertised, and you can have it either for £42,000 or alternatively €32,000.
Patrick bought it.
You bought it!
Yes.
Congratulations! It's probably a lot better than when I had it. I won't be rude. I won't be so rude as to ask you what you paid. Right, okay. Now, this is not a good picture. There are much better pictures in the albums at the back. This was the car that was built for Prince William of Gloucester. Very, very high specification, and I think, Andrew, the specification of your car on this one. So if you're looking at it, for example, it hasn't got the hooded rims, and I believe the car that you bought, sir, that also now has the chrome rims on the headlights. I saw a picture of it recently, so that the eggbox grille, again, unusual. Absolutely the ultimate, and I think it was built to the same specification as the Harrington Works demonstrator, which one of my uncles used to use a lot. What happened to that car, I wonder? I think probably Prince William, who subsequently died in an air crash, I think he probably sold it on before he died, because he certainly subsequently owned an Aston Martin DB4. But what happened to it, no idea at all. I'd love to know though. is again one that was raced at Sebring in 1962 and 63. The car was acquired by a chap called Filippo Teodoli, who was an advertising executive based in New York. He bought it directly from Harrington's, having raced the standard shaped Series 2 at Sebring in 61. That car, again, was converted subsequently to road car spec, and some parts of it, at least, are back on track now. The car was reshelled. It came over to this country for a while. I believe it's now back in America. Also, the bodywork conversions for the 1962 and then 1963 Le Mans cars. All sorts of different shapes were tried in the wind tunnel. The one that was eventually settled on was this so-called camtail version, and that particular one is parked over by the coach at present. That is one of the photographs that was taken when the car had just been completed, and 3 of those were built, 2 of which survive. Yeah, although the Harrington name doesn't appear on it anywhere, we're certain that Harrington's carried out the modifications, because one of the documents that came to light a few years ago was the results of the wind tunnel testing that had been done, and also the build specs for the car, and it specifically mentions in that the bodies were sent to Harrington's for modification. One thing I would mention, probably should have done at the time, was that although the Harrington that ran at Le Mans 61 looked nice and sleek with those fared-in headlights and everything, it was actually slower than the standard shape car, probably because it was heavier as much as anything else. The Le Mans was expensive, and partly in response to that, the Series C was introduced, and there have been 2 Series Cs here today. There were 3 up at Withell a few weeks ago, which is not a bad turnout when the general reckoning is that probably no more than a dozen or so of them survive. That's, to my mind, and I think I'm allowed to be biased, it's probably the most attractive of all the variants. But you could argue that one till the cows come home. And that one again shows that you've got the benefit of the opening tailgate, as on the Le Mans, but without the cut down rear wings, which obviously added so much to the cost of producing the Le Mans. Health and safety? Well, just as the article in the Horn a couple of editions ago showed the bodywork being fitted to Harrington Le Mans, this one shows, in this instance, Series C roof being removed from the fiberglass mould. They're not wearing gloves, no sign of safety shoes or anything like that. And fiberglass strands, pretty nasty things, but they're. But I guess we didn't know about those things in those days. That just shows the bodywork pre-fitting, and then finally the roof being fitted on. You'll notice in this one that, yeah, whilst it's showing the roof being fitted to a Series C, there are actually 3, I think, Harrington Le Mans in the picture. So the 2 ran alongside one another for quite a time. And that's, again, a fairly standard spec Series C. Again, I'm afraid that's my car. Not here at present. With their crate grille and Webasto roof, both of which were fitted from new. As we all know, Roots decided to change the windscreen shape between the Series 2 and the Series 3 Alpine. Consequently, the roofline on the Series C Harrington no longer fitted. Therefore, it had to be modified. The mould had to be changed in order to fit the Series 3 Alpine. and onwards to the Series 4 as well. And there was one, and as I'm as sure as I can be, only one Tiger that was actually built by Harringtons right towards the end of the company's coach building activities. But well documented, again, currently lives in the States, often regarded as being the ultimate Harrington. I have to admit, to my mind, the ultimate Harrington would be the one that John Horseman, who was the managing director of the Gulf Wire Porsche team, Ford and later Porsche team during the 60s. He had a Harrington Le Mans Alpine spec, but because they had access to various V8 Ford engines, because of running the Ford GT40 program, and because John Horseman had worked with a chap called Des O'Dell at Aston Martin, and Des went on to be the competition manager at Roots, John Horseman was able to acquire all the necessary parts for converting his Harrington Le Mans to full Tiger specification, which he duly did. And that is one of those which I wish I'd been a bit more imaginative at the time, because it was auctioned in this country a few years ago. It actually went to Greece, which is where it lives now. And somebody thought that because it was owned by John Horseman, it would be a jolly good idea to paint it in Gulf colours, whereas it should be Carnival red. But I'll stop there. That, to my mind, would be the ultimate. Now, there are lots of myths and mysteries around Harrington Alpines. There was never an A-type, there was never a B-type, there was never any type of Harrington Alpine. There was the Harrington Alpine, the Harrington Le Mans, the Harrington Series C, the Harrington Series D. I think referring to them as A-type and B-type and so forth is sort of convenient shorthand which has been adopted recently. It's not actually an official name. I mentioned earlier about the thought that the prototype was a Series 1. No, the prototype would have been a Series 2. There are Series 1s around, those were retrofitted. One I read recently with Filippo Teodoli, the chap who raced the car at Sebring. He had not North American Racing Team stickers on the car. I read somewhere, and forgive me, I can't remember where, that he owned not. He didn't. He was an advertising executive. North American Racing Team were one of his clients. I think it was the only British car ever to carry NART stickers. They always ran Ferraris or Oscars. Another one, all Le Mans had Hartwell engines. No, Hartwell engines were offered as an option in 3 different tuning stages. But there's one in particular I know of that's got a little brass plaque which says engine standard, not to Le Mans specification. So they didn't all have Hartwell engines. Hartwells and Harringtons were very closely connected, but they didn't. Now, some mysteries, and please, if anybody can help me on any of these, I'd be delighted. Dating the triplex glass. Some of you might know that you can date triplex glass according to where there is a dot over triplex glass on the marked into it. I've got some panels that got a couple of side glasses at home, and I've seen others which are dated August 1959. There is no way that the car was designed in August 59. Are those side windows possibly the same as used on some other car? Don't know. Was that just an anomaly in the way those those side glasses were marked? Don't know, but I'm intrigued to know why it would be marked as if they were made in August 59. reputedly, there are two or three Harrington-bodied Daimler ST250s, Daimler Darts that were built. I've never found a picture of a real one. Yes, there was the picture of a model one, even to the extent that I went and made a nuisance of myself with the Daimler SP250 Owners Club at an event last year. None of them have heard anything of them. So I suspect that might just have been a figment of the model maker's imagination. But again, if somebody could prove me wrong on that, I'd love to know. 9202 RW, one of the three cars that was built for Le Mans in 1962, disappeared. Story has it that the owner of it in the mid-1970s, by which time it was a bit of a wreck. It had led a very hard life, being used for off-road rallying, autocrossing and so forth. The owner of it put it into a garage in Preston, I believe, went abroad on business for a few months and came back to an empty garage. Nothing has been seen or heard of it since. There is a replica of the square-tailed ones in Australia at present, which has been beautifully done, but it's certainly not one of the originals. And the owner of it doesn't claim it to be one of the originals. It's a replica. So what happened to 9202? No idea. And as we mentioned earlier, what happened to Prince William's car? Don't know. We didn't only do Alpines. There was the TR4 Duvet, built for Doves of Wimbledon. Again, same sort of principle, taking a TR4 chassis and attaching a hardtop to it, specifically for that one Triumph dealer. Speedboats made of fiberglass. Again, not many of these were built. I mean, one of the things I find so amusing about this photograph, which was publicity, is that you go out in a speedboat wearing your suit and tie. That's two of my uncles, actually, who were in it at the time. I have a very clear, horribly clear recollection of spending a thoroughly miserable Sunday morning on the River Adur down in Shoreham, with the engine, a roof's outboard, forever honking out. It never ran for more than a few seconds at a time. There were a few of those boats built. I haven't seen one for ages. First glance, it looks like a motor caravan. It's not, it's a 12-seater bus. This, interestingly, was marketed as a Harrington. Again, that was a mark of the relationship between Roots and Harringtons. Now, what happened was when Harrington ceased the coach building business, all of the tooling for the caravan, for the light coach and that, they were all transferred to Roots Maidstone, just down the road here, who specialised, amongst their other activities, in building vehicles specifically or particularly for people with disabilities. And Roots Maidstone carried on producing the motor caravans, the buses, the small buses and so forth, through to the 70s and early 80s. Anybody got one of those? It's a spiked meat dish. Yeah, built by Harringtons. I suppose as a sign of what the company needed, was doing in order to use the capacity that it had got, it built small runs or prototypes of various different products. Now, it was made initially. It was made and branded for Chichester Metalcraft. So it was branded as Chichester Metalcraft. These things are still made, and the company that makes them now, who took on the Chichester Metalcraft business, is a company called Dexam. And when Harrington's coach building activities ceased in about 1965 or so, quite a number of the people, including one of the directors, Clifford Harrington, moved over. In fact, Clifford moved over before then to Dexam, Chichester Metalcraft, and continued with the manufacture of these. But the original ones were actually made in the factory in the old Shoreham Road in Hove.
So they weren't branded.
They weren't branded as Harrington.
But later on they did brand.
No, they were never branded as Harrington.
No,
They were just,
Dexam and the other company branded.
yes, yeah, that's right. So effectively a subcontract. You've been incredibly patient. But has anybody got any questions or comments or corrections? Because the one thing I would not claim is any monopoly of knowledge on these. I've probably got things wrong inadvertently going through.
Glenn, before he died, Danny Bob told me that 9202 was in France.
I think I know why he told. I think I know the story behind that. I think. I can't be sure. At the Le Mans Classic, 4 years ago, I can't remember, there was a Sunbeam Alpine entered, and the picture in the programme was of 9202. The car didn't turn up, but it did subsequently turn up at an event at Spa, which I happened to be at, and it's actually a standard-bodied Series 2 Alpine painted up to look like 9202, but it hasn't got the raised boot lid. I think, again, I can't be sure, but I think that was why Jan might have thought that 9202 was in France. It's owned by it's owned by somebody from France, but I can't remember the chap's name offhand.
When did the company end and why?
When and why? Right. It ceased its coach building activities in 1965. Broadly speaking, it was financial. It carried on as a Roots dealership for a long time thereafter. But in about 1960, the Roots family effectively bought in and took control of the company. It had been a public company in its own right, shares traded on the stock exchange, or some of the shares traded on the stock exchange. It was quite closely held within the Harrington family, but essentially it was financial. It needed injections of capital. Roots, not the manufacturing business. Basically, the Roots family, they had the manufacturing business, and they had a business called Robbins and Day, which ran a number of dealerships, again, including the one here in Maidstone. And they bought into it. They put members of the Roots family onto the board. George Hartwell, who I mentioned earlier was connected with the business, he took on as chairman, and gradually the members of the family moved away. The original Thomas Harrington's two sons, Thomas Jr. and Ernest, they both retired from the business in the late 1950s. They died in 63 and 64. Their sons remained in the business, but gradually moved on to other things. I think my father actually was the last one standing, as it were. He was running the Worthing branch up until 1965. And his younger brother was sales director, again, till about the same time. But from 1965, there was no longer any family involvement in the business. It was entirely owned by the Roots family then.
One of those earlier shops of one of the Maharaja.
Yes.
Is it a shortened down version of the Spirit of Ecstasy?
I don't think it is. I don't think it is. It looks as though it could possibly be an elephant's head.
If it is a shortened version, then that is the only ones that can have a shortened version. She's kneeling down.
Right.
If it's made for royalty.
Really?
Yeah.
I need to look at the photograph more carefully.
I had a friend who had a car that had a kneel down one.
Yes.
Made for the Middle Eastern royal.
Right.
So it might be that. But it might not.
That is a possibility. I had sort of assumed.
They would be royalty.
Well, they would. Yes. Yeah. They'd be certainly for those purposes. They'd be classed as such. I had sort of assumed that it might have been a figure of one of the Hindu gods or something like that. But again, I might be wrong.
But a kneel down version is
Denotes a card
car
for royalty.
built for the coach.
Yeah.
Everything was done for royalty.
Right. Right. Thank you. Dwayne, you had another one.
Yeah, when was the fire?
The fire? What fire?
Destroyed all the records.
Could have been such, sometime from after 1966. It was just one of those things where we probably all come across it at different times. They were just taking up space that probably was regarded as being more valuable than the records that were being kept there. I'm afraid that in business there isn't a lot of sentiment. We are we're putting things back together. I mean, I've been able to acquire various photographs. Clive's been able to acquire various records, but the fire. I think that's sort of a little bit of shorthand for a lot of the records were destroyed, chucked out, rubbish tip, whatever. I very much doubt it. I very much doubt it. Certainly not to my knowledge.
I've got a sign.
Oh,
With the factory. Sign.
A time, right.
It's the rear entrance sign for the bus.
really?
Come on, I'll show you a picture.
Correct.
But unfortunately not one that could then be used for doing a reproduction roof.
That's what I'm thinking, you
It's a
still
start.
have the bulbs, you can still have the...
No, I mean, again, the sort of mould that you use for glass fibre, it just gets chucked once you've decided that you're not going to make any more of those. Any more? No, well, thank you very much indeed. I've quite overshot the time, Tim.
You've certainly not overshot your time. Wasn't that great? Absolutely spellbinding. This is the man himself, Justin Harrington. Come on. Okay. I'm sure actually a lot of you are going to buttonhole him in a minute and ask him one-to-one questions. I know that's going to happen. So you're going to stick around for the evening, aren't you?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Right. He's
I
round.
believe there's a bar here.
There is a bar. Yeah. I'm sure they'll buttonhole you over a pint. They'll tell you that. Right.
Lost.
lot easier and fun, and you'd use it on that basis. So if anybody wanted it returned to original, yeah, it could be. But, yeah, the interior is pretty much apart from the rock I have one already.
Do you want me fancy?
I'll have, there was one sale on Maker's the other day, it's got that new old stock, it's 250. What you don't know is